This
Okay,
is
hello everybody.
University.
We are now online. So let's say hi to everybody.
Hello.
hello.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our TLTS channel again. And today we are very, very happy, especially for me. I'm the most happy person today because we have Professor Judith Green with us. And you know, Judith is more than just a professor to me. She is my auntie. She's my intellectual auntie. Because my supervisor, that is my intellectual father, Professor James Heap, back in the 1990s in Toronto, University of Toronto, Professor James Heap, and Professor Judith Green, they are very good friends, intellectual friends. So that's why Professor Judith Green is my intellectual auntie. And today I'm so happy, plus being honored to have her with us. So without further ado, I'll let our co-hosts, our student co-hosts, so starting from Tsinghua, Phoebe, Bongyi, and Amy, you just briefly introduce yourself.
Okay, so I'll go first. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Tsinghua, and I'm a PhD student at Simon Fraser University. Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Phoebe from Hong Kong, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Hong Kong.
Hi everyone, my name is Bongyi. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Simon Fraser University, working under Angel Lin, and very honored to have you all here today.
Hello everyone, I'm Amy Wu. I'm a PhD student at the Faculty of Education at University of Hong Kong. I'm working in the area of translanguaging and transsemiotising, and I'm very glad to see everyone and also have dialogues with all the generations of researchers here.
Thank you. So Judith doesn't need introduction, but we do have a bio of her on our YouTube. So without further ado, I will hand over the floor to Judith to give a brief introduction of the topic today, interactional ethnography. And then after this brief introduction, then the different co-hosts will ask questions, and then we will also ask questions from the online typing in. So feel free to type in questions as we are speaking. Okay, over to you, Judith.
Okay, so I am so delighted to be here. Ni hao. That's I know 7 words in Chinese.
Ni hao, Cantonese too. I am from Hong Kong, Cantonese.
How do you say it in Cantonese?
Ni hao. And also from Guangdong. Most of my students are also from Guangdong. They also speak Cantonese. Sorry, I need to promote Cantonese.
That's fine. You will find out.
I also speak Mandarin. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you will find out why I do interactional ethnography. And what I did is take all the questions you posed originally, and I did an analysis of them. But I broke up your sentences into small bits so I could understand what you had read and what you thought and how I agreed or disagreed with the way you interpreted some things. And so what I thought I would do would be to help you understand. And since we have people joining us on YouTube, help them understand because they will not have read some of the work. And feel free, I'm New York, so you can jump in anytime and ask a question. And if you want, just signal and Tsinghua will help us. I'll stop. It won't be rude. It will be our norm. We can create our own cultural practices for this because we are ethnographers. Okay? So what I'm going to do is put up a PowerPoint and just kind of show you some of the kind of issues. But what I thought I would do, since this will be posted afterwards, is that I would give everybody credit who sent me questions that I had, okay? And that way everybody's here, and I identified both universities. So anyway, my goal is really to begin to engage you in a dialogue, okay, with the ones who sent me things, but anybody else who wants to come in, about what is interactional ethnography as a micro-ethnographic and discourse analytic logic of inquiry, not a method. And that's a really important piece to come to understand. This is a way of thinking, a way of knowing, a way of engaging, but it's not a method. It draws on different theories and methods when we have to analyze different kinds of records that you've collected. We don't call what we collect data. We make data. It's part of a turn in the social sciences. It's the linguistic, cultural, and social and reflexive turns in the social sciences that show that we construct the data. We don't just collect it. That's more of an from a more positivist frame where you predefine what's going on. We don't. So I'm trying to look at how it is as an iterative, recursive, and abductive process, which means, do you know what inductive is, right? You go from the bottom to a known whole. Deductive, do you know what that is, right? You go from this whole and break it into its parts. Abductive doesn't know the whole. It follows the trail and it does a recursive process of following the trail, raising new questions, identifying new ways of records you need to analyze, new histories, new levels of analysis, okay? And there is a whole philosophy on that, and there's a whole controversy around it, but that's okay. What I want you to think about as I'm talking is you could make two columns. You could say, this is what she's saying, no, I don't agree, or I do agree. Or what actions, and a third column might be, what actions should I take if I agree with this? So as you're thinking about it, you're beginning to not just listen, not just write down, but begin to build a concept map for yourself of the ideas. And that's a big piece of the puzzle, is that in this, it's a conceptual system you're trying to build and think about. So the questions you gave me were just amazing. Some of the deepest I've ever had. And it made me go back all the way to the beginning. And this has been going on it's been developing for the past 5 decades. Okay? And there have been more than 50 dissertations done through this in different sites in different ways and different kinds of situations. But most of the time they work with the people, not study on the people. So David Bloom and I have built a distinction between ethnography of education, which is ethnography situated in disciplines like sociology and other disciplines for their purposes, and ethnography in education, which has 2 threads. One is Spindler, and Spindler's work over a 16-year period or more than that, and Katie Anderson Levitt. And there's a whole thing where she followed, did anthropologies around the world, a book. And that book showed that every country had its own theories guiding it. So there's not going to be one answer, one ethnography, okay? And David and I made a distinction between doing ethnography, adopting an ethnographic perspective, and engaging in ethnographic field methods. So we don't start with field methods, we start with an ethnographic perspective. The doing of ethnography is the whole. Okay, there are arguments over since the 1980s, with the reflexive turn in social science about how we produce the data, even in the anthropology world and the sociology world and the applied linguistics world. So if you're interested in those articles and roots, I can provide some of them later. But in applied linguistics, Mary Buchholz has done one in 2000 in the Journal of Applied Linguistics that talks about even the way we transcribe creates the person. creates the other, not records the talk. It's a much more complicated process. So what I was trying to think about was, okay, so how do I frame it? So we've already introduced you, and I'm sharing my plans, and they welcome new questions along the way. But this is the background for IE, for interactional ethnography, okay? Now, it was grounded in work with John Gumpers on interactional sociolinguistics. He was my mentor. He was my intellectual father in many ways. It'll come up again. But it's the people you work with intellectually that influence how you think. And so this is an interdisciplinary. James Heath brought ethnomethodology to me. And he and I would be on panels together. So we brought different traditions in the same panel. And we would go and give talks. And you want to do that when you build your network, because when you go for promotion and tenure, they will want, you want people who know your work, but aren't your friends in the classic sense. Okay? So building that intellectual network is a piece of the puzzle. But anthropology has social anthropology from the UK and linguistic anthropology from the US. But now they have linguistic ethnography in the UK, building off of Gumpers, and the ethnography of communication work has morphed. Applied linguistics, critical discourse analysis of Norman Fairclough and Roz Ivanich, who was his student. These were people we came together and had intellectual dialogues. The educational, social, and discursive construction of everyday life, which is the microethnographic in classrooms. It's not just ethnography. There's different kinds of ethnographies. But there's a review. The new chapter I did gives you the history of microethnography back to the 70s. So it's in the review of research and education, but it's not doing the whole, and we'll come back to that, but it's focusing with an ethnographic perspective, what we call in our community ethnographic eyes. One of my alums, Carolyn Frank, has written a book that's picked up by Teacher Education called Ethnographic Eyes with student teachers, on how they can see their communities, their groups, and ways of understanding who the people are and how. We have teachers becoming ethnographers, taking it up with children. So we're going to see one of those today. Sociocultural theories, and that works with the learning sciences or the human sciences or different things depending. I have a Vygotskian background, I have a Bakhtinian background, I have a range of different theories that we draw on. And sociolinguistics, both in Gumper's sense, but Himes and others who built the whole ethnography of communication field. In the US, and actually between the US and the UK, there was a big meeting in the 1970s where scholars came together across disciplines to create the Teaching as a Linguistic Process grants, and why you needed to look at the classroom and deconstruct the deficit model. So a lot of this is coming out of the deconstruction of psychological models that were cognitive deficits or language deficits. They came out originally in the 60s and 70s, said children come with no language. And the linguists and the psychologists and others came together and said, no, they come with full language systems. They may not come with the language of the classroom or the school. And so that's where that root comes. We've now moved, because I worked with Susan Bridges in the medical part in the University of Hong Kong and the problem-based learning, and with Mona Lisa Chan there. The key is that group has taken me into the learning sciences, which has a slightly different angle, but we have a new handbook chapter for them on interactional ethnography that builds on Susan's work and shows the history of her work coming in and then how. So you might want to think about this for yourselves. What are your roots? ROOTS. That are leading you to translanguaging, transsemiotizing, and maybe even interactional ethnography. Why would you do this? There's a new book going to be coming out this year called Becoming an Ethnographer, and it's people's histories of becoming. Okay, just like Michelle Obama wrote, her book was called Becoming. So becoming is the new concept that's coming in. It's from a post-humanist frame and other frames, but people are now tracing why they chose particular research traditions. I do have a statistics background. I have done statistical studies. I don't do experimental design, but I could. And I could take an ethnographic look at the process we did. Sociology, I do have James is my cultural guide, but there's a book called Four Traditions of Sociology, and Bill Corsaro, I edited his book on Pure Culture and Friendship of the Young Child, and he helped me see even how to take field notes differently. Okay, do you want me to share with you what he said? Okay, so if I have a notebook, where's my notebook? Oh, I moved everything so I'd look neat. Okay, so pretend that this is a notebook, not an iPad. Okay? When I write my field notes, I put them on this side. So it's called a running record in our language. We put time marker here so we can make a line or show when every event changed in the classroom. So it's not just talk, because we're there from the first day of school. Now, I don't have to be to do it in interactional ethnography, but the majority of my students and people who have worked with me, we go with teachers on the first day so we can look at how the students enter, how they engage them before the first day, what their goals are, how they're thinking about it, because that's all the backstory if you're taking a theater metaphor. It's not, but it's critical because I can go back and analyze that, and I'll show you why. Okay? On this side, there are three kinds of notes. These are called FNs, field notes. One, as you're doing it, things pop into your head, right? As you're observing. Oh, this is like what Piaget was talking about. Oh, this is like what Dr. Lim was talking about. So you want to put, that's called a theoretical note. You're making a link between what you're seeing and what you are beginning to understand, but you want to do it exactly opposite where it came in. You don't want to take it on a separate card. So if you've got field notes, you're writing them, all of a sudden you remember something, you make a link, put it on the other page. So only write on one side of the page and then put your annotation for your thought, your thinking on the other side. So you're going to make a link. Now it can be another kind of theory. It can be, oh, I wonder if this is a repeated pattern. Because all of a sudden you're seeing, if I were a student in this class, this is what I would need to do next. So you're beginning to build hypotheses, you're beginning to see patterns, right? Those are called those are theoretical notes too. There are different kinds. Now, what most people don't do is reconstruct where they were standing, where they were sitting, what they could see. Those are methodological notes. The decisions you want to make. And if you change because you want to go sit next to another person. So my very first day, you want a very funny story? My very first day in this classroom with this teacher who had been nominated by the writing project that we have here at Santa Barbara. And I had talked with her and everything was fine. I brought my brand new video camera in. This was 1990. And she told me to stand. They had a doorway with a closet behind it. So I stood in the doorway. So I wasn't disrupting the class. I was going to be the fly on the wall. The teacher is in charge of who I am and where I am. Students may come up to me, and if to tie a belt, around them, or to put something on, or help them with something, if she doesn't want me to do it, she'll tell me. If she doesn't say anything, she gave the students permission. She didn't say anything when Beto came over and took my camera and became the camera person. And I had to go, okay, now recess came. And after recess, she had everybody in a circle. She said, no, Judith and Anna, that I had a doctoral student with me, you guys have to come in and you have to do this. And we had to play the name game with the students. So she engaged us in the process. I did not know until later that she was going to have the students be researchers with us. And as we started to leave, she made us read our field notes to the students. So how you negotiate the roles and relationship in an ethnographic study is there's no such thing as objectivity. There's an intersubjective relationship you're building. And you want to document all of that. If you move, if you talk to things, that's why I said you write methodological notes opposite where the field note is. Now, Bill Corsaro talks about those as boiled down, like a cooking. They're boiled down. It's not a lot of juice. You go home, you have head notes in your head, right? You remember things you didn't write down. So now you cook them up. So we did it by using two different typefaces. So you knew what the original notes looked like and what the additional notes, the head notes. Now you don't have to do that after every single class or every single observation. Or actually, they're not observations, are they? They're participations, depending on how you participate. Okay? When I was trying to do it in a class I didn't know, it was just visiting. I was taking notes in this high school class. And afterwards, the students came up to me and said, are you a narcotics agent? And I went, what? No, here, do you want to see what I'm writing? I'm just looking at what your teacher's doing. Oh, it's good. You need to. Okay? So you aren't invisible. And as an ethnographer, you have to document yourself within the process. Your thinking, not just what you're recording. What you record, Gregory Bateson back in 1970 said, that is not the phenomena. That's a record made by you. And when you leave the field, all you have is the record. Well, with ethnography, you also have head notes. If you then reconstruct your day, we call them reconstructed field notes, okay? So you can do them. They're legitimate. You were there, you observed. This is where you're thinking, but you're not going to make a claim from that. You're going to need to use it as part of the triangulation of information. Does that make sense? Now, Susan Bridges has taken me into this whole multimodality. I've always done multimodal text, but we didn't have that name back in the 60s and 70s, okay? So when I started my work in ethnography in 72 to 77, where I was doing my dissertation, we didn't have the word multimodal. So theories are always building, right? So you want to think about how was it referred to? So Greg Kelly gives us a kind of definition. This is from the Handbook of Complementary Methods in Education Research. He did the chapter on epistemology. Okay? So he argues that epistemological perspectives are not frozen in time. Okay? Rather, they're continuously being reformulated through ongoing developmental and definitional work regarding the creation and specification an extension of research groups' central series, not your personal theory. It's the group you're working with, who you're working with, the kind of series you're building. They're going to evolve. What I do know in physics, and Greg was a physicist, okay, is that time doesn't exist. It's a fixed point that streams go through, okay? There's a film called The Powers of 10 on YouTube. It will show you how to go from a picnic by the power of 10 into space and then come back through space into the cell. So you want to see what's your unit of analysis? Why are you using what unit, and what can you see from that distance from the object? Okay? So you're trying to think about, if I take a word, how do I know what it means? And we'll come back to that. Okay? He says that the extensions, he argues, results not from a linear progression within a group. So you're building theory. My mentor, Milyami, who was one of the founders of early childhood, she said, you are a theorist. But she also wanted me, and I had 3 people do this to me. Piaget wrote the introduction to her book on young children's thinking. So when I read Piaget, I would make up something or interpret it, and she'd say, no, Green, what did Piaget say? Okay, there is a study that was done that's a difference between reading Piaget or seeing an interview of him, okay, on Swiss television and then reading him. Thierry Inglese, who's in Switzerland, did this dissertation, okay? And she found that the students who saw the interview, which had nothing to do with what they were reading, just his thinking, had a different interpretation and different way of understanding his series. So think about how to engage the conversation. Okay, it's not a linear progression, and there are debates within the community. So what you want to know is, okay, so what are the debates about translanguaging? What's the debates about trans-semiotizing? When I use those words with some people, they go, what? They don't know what it means because they haven't read the literature. So how are you going to engage them in learning about what you're talking about? Okay, so that's part of the issue. Now, telling case studies is controversial too. I'm going to present what I'm doing now is trying to help you theorize what's going on. That's a type of telling case ethnographically. But there was it was framed in 1984 in a book called Ethnographic Research by R.F. Ellen. He did a chapter where he brought different people to do different parts of producing data in ethnographies. Because he said there is no one ethnography, and it can be a word, it can be a text, it can be a process, it can be lots of different things. And he, for the British sociology world, opened up the question of, so what counts as ethnography? And how do we produce data? Mitchell in there built the concept that of telling case studies. I'll give you his definition in a minute. Brian Street, who was one of the founders of the New Literacy World Studies, who's done work all over the world in literacy studies in Iran, in Africa, in different places, in Brazil, and things like that. His work is culture as a verb. Now, he's not the first to say that, but I'll come back to that, okay? How do you even define the term culture? That was one of the questions that came up. Culture as a verb is an anthropological frame from social and linguistic anthropology, okay? It's also from new literacy studies. And that's an area that grew up at the intersection of critical sociology and anthropology. It depends on who's perspective you choose. Okay, and there is a handbook of new literacy studies, but they brought all of us together to look at how you study literacy. Today, we just had a journal come out from the Brazilian journal on trabalhos en linguística aplicada, which is, it's an applied linguistics, and it's free online, but it's on literacies, researching literacies in social languages and social domains. And each of the authors is from a different country and studying different dimensions and how to study these things. So think about your work as building in a whole new field of way of thinking. How do you begin to do that type of thing? And so you could visit the journal and see how different pieces came in, including, whose voice counts and who doesn't, African American scholarship not counting, different kinds of issues. You have one of your group members, Sally Gupta. Her piece is very, very important there, tracing all the layers of collaboration that had to go to build CLIL, right? And it's a brilliant piece. So these are pieces that are not your ordinary, but they come together to create visions of different ways of seeing, ways of studying literacies across languages and social spaces. So telling cases, therefore, if you look at the PowerPoint, are the detailed presentation of ethnographic data, which you've constructed, right, and collected records to make, relating to, this is the key, some sequence of events which you as analyst seek to make some theoretical inference about. It's not description. It's beyond description. The goal of this kind of ethnography is, Bill Corsaro talks about sociology, ethnography tends to be more method. For anthropology, is theory generating about culture and everyday life. So the difference of the discipline is important to understand. Okay? And the difference in the discipline in national context is important to understand. Okay, so the events themselves may relate to any level of social organization. So what level of social organization are you studying, right? It can be a whole society, not in my lifetime, but that's okay. Some section of a community, a family, or an individual. So, but what you're going to do is you're going to trace that person across the sequence of events. That means you're going to get not only that person, but all the fingers that go around them, right? So if you use my finger, there's all this context. So you're going to get their interactions with different people and different sites, with different materials, with different resources. That's what Susan and I just did for a paper that we've submitted a revision on. We traced 5 different times that the student had to, in a medical setting, in problem-based learning, he had to draw, the key was pediatric coronary, how to represent it visually. So the dialogue went in a problem-based learning situation. And we did frame grabs to show the different texts. It took 5 different iterations with the guide, the facilitator, before they added the heartbeat, not just draw the heart. But how do you represent that heartbeat and how do you deal with it? That's the question. And how do you graphically represent what you're learning so that you can show your work? It's called transparency. How do you make your work and thinking transparent to a reader, to an outsider? Okay? So you're going to have a description of a specific configuration of events or people, okay, or times, in which some distinctive set of actors. So if you think about bounding this, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 actors that I can see, but I know there's other people lurking behind the scene on YouTube, but I can't put YouTube up to see. Okay? So there's a distinctive set of actors here, but there's also this other set of actors behind, and I can't see behind me. Does that make sense? So if you're in a classroom, you have a distinctive set of actors. If you're in a theater, are you going to focus on the actors on the stage? You're going to focus on the audience? Who are you focusing on? How are you bounding your units? Shirley Bryce Heath has a whole new program of research she presented a couple of years ago from New York, looking at theater being produced. I work with a person who does embodied theater. I got a question, I think, Phoebe, you asked the question about the director. Which theory of directing? Okay, there is more than one, and the director that I worked with has an embodied group, and they don't block the stage. They create where things are going to be with the actors. Different form of directing, right? So you need to watch the terms you're going to choose and where you're choosing them from. There is a really good website that I shared with Qinghua yesterday called Words in Space, which is a media research space, but she does ethnography. And it's Shannon Mattern. If you look at it, you will see how she thinks about the art fields and the art worlds influencing how she sees the ethnographic. So what theories are you going to draw on? Okay? And it's always in some defined situation at some point in time. Okay, so now, the problem you made me aware of, and I thank you because it's important, is that conceptual foundations of IE or other traditions are not always visible in the writing of a particular article in a particular journal. Most of the work is in books. Much of it is an edited book. My Ethnography in Language and Educational Settings book, which was done in 1981, friends gave me a conference when I graduated, and we had 110 people from 10 states went because John Gumpers came, Carl Fredrickson came, Bill Corsaro came to Kent State. And we ran a conference, and 4 years later, we published the book from the conference. It's on ethnography in language and educational settings, and it's been identified as one of 4 early pieces that kind of ground some of this work. So the concept of culture, here's where we get this from Michael Agar. Now, Michael Agar, I read first, then I met him at a conference, and then I invited him, like you invited me, to Santa Barbara, but we did a whole week with him. And then 3 months later, we did another 3 days. So we could see how we took up his work. But he says culture, the concept of culture, like the concept of language, has to change. Would you agree? So it's not about which culture you have. And I always ask my students, wait a minute, is your family a culture? Well, I know that my brother and I didn't have the same growing up experience, so it was different worlds. Is when you leave your house, are you entering another stream of social world? Is that a culture? Do you see what I mean by the concept of culture? How are you going to bound it? It isn't an identity. It isn't a thing you have. We have cultural processes and practices from these social groups we work with. I just found out in capoeira, which is the Brazilian martial arts dance thing, people are given nicknames. So you don't even have the same name sometimes when you're in another group. So how do you trace it? There is a book called The Learning, it's Identities and Learning Lives of Students in a Digital Age. It traces different research perspectives, tracing students across different social worlds. You might want to look at it. It's Erstad and Sefton Green, ERSTAD, from Norway. He had a 2 or 3 year grant that brought different researchers together to talk about how to study these different sites. And then he brought the book together, and he has some others. There's also a special issue of the International Journal of Ed Research that he and Christina Kumpelainen did. So when you see how things are changing, terminology has to change. Concepts. But a word is a conceptual phenomena. It is not, and it's situated within a particular context. Two concepts have to change together, he said. If you change language, you're changing culture. But now we talk about languaging, right? Not just language. So there's a new book out by David Bloom and Rick Beach on languaging with a bunch of people who have written on it in classrooms and schools. You do translanguaging, right? You make it into a verb. Oh, answer this. Do Cantonese or Mandarin, are they subject-verb-object languages?
They are subject-verb-object language, SVO.
They are? Both of them?
The word order. You're talking about word order, right, Judith? Yeah? SVO, yeah. Subject-verb-object. But in classical Chinese, 文言文, 文言文, that is ancient Chinese, when Confucius written in, then the word order is slightly different.
Yeah. So, but English is a subject-verb-object language. So what we do.
Same for Chinese. Chinese.
So we use present continuous. Do you have present continuous verbs?
Yeah, we have aspects. We don't have tense marker, but we have aspect marker. Like Judith is presenting the ing. In Cantonese, at least. Yeah. We don't have a tense marker, but we use adverbials like yesterday or right now. Judith is presenting.
Yeah. So since it's a subject verb object, when you're writing your narrative, your analysis, we don't do it as nouns. We do it as the verb plus the object, because we're looking at the processes and the practices, as well as the meanings being constructed through those processes and practices. Okay? And for them and by them, whatever you want. Language in all varieties, in all ways, appears in everyday life, builds worlds of meaning. That's what you study, right? You're looking at the meaning making? Is that what transsemiotizing means? I'm trying to understand it because I'm just getting to know it through visiting with Dr. Lin and some of the other people and talking to some of you. So it's exciting to see that there's a whole field growing on that. When you run into different meanings, this is the key for Agar, and this is the key for us. When you become aware of your own and the work, and you work to build a bridge to others. So if I'm watching something and all of a sudden somebody says something in a funny way, I go, what? That's when culture happens, he says. If you're following it and it's ordinary, it's not, you belong to that understanding. But when you don't, then you're coming up against culture, frame clashes. In Goffman's sense, it's a frame clash. Gumpers and Tannen talk about frame clashes, miscommunications.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I jump in with an example?
Sure.
You just said, usually a monolingual teacher, when a student, like for example, in one of our classroom excerpts that Pei Chang and myself did, We have a local Cantonese English-speaking science teacher teaching a group of South Asian students in Hong Kong. They speak Urdu. So when the teacher talks about whether camels are herbivores, so the teacher doesn't understand, because in Hong Kong you will never see a camel. So even though the science teacher is supposed to be in the authority role, she doesn't know. But the students know. The students say, yes, of course, camels are herbivores. And then they spoke out the name of camel in their home language. Oons, oons, oons. And here the teacher, with this frame crash, but with humility, she says, using the Japanese manga gesture, I learned something. Right? So I'm just trying to jump in with an example. Yeah.
That's perfect. And that's a brilliant example of what we're talking about.
But you could imagine another teacher who is not like this teacher, who will be no home language, right, only English or Chinese in this classroom.
But that what you've just identified is also another philosophical issue, which is there are three kinds of theories. There's the personal theory and personal knowledge. There's formal theory, and there's grounded theorizing. Okay? Now, some teachers only deal with their personal knowledge and personal theory, and that's what gets reproduced. But there are a lot of teachers I've worked with over the last 6 decades, including when I was a teacher myself in elementary school, in a bilingual school. Okay, well, we'll come to that in a minute. The key is that you have different theories, and whose theory is going to count, and how is it going to shape what possible for the students to know, which is what our ethnographic frame is. So he says language, and I added oral, visual, and written, fills the spaces between us with sounds, visual images, print, other things. Culture forges the human connection, he says. This is Michael Agar. So culture is in language, and language is loaded with culture. And that leads him to calling what we're going to get to his concept of languaculture. That's what we have, is languaculture, not language and culture. Now, Frake in 1977, when you had me go back to my roots, I found this because it was one of the earliest ones that I read that argued that culture is not simply a cognitive map that people acquire in whole or in part, more or less accurately, and then learn to read. People are not just map readers, they're map makers. That's a key concept, because we do mapping, and I forgot this was one of the roots of the mapping. People are cast out into imperfectly charted, continually revised sketch maps. I love that. The terrain is always changing. There's a book called The Power of Maps. It's on how map makers make maps and how each one, but there's also a book on the map that invented the world. It's a fiction book, but based on cartography. And it's about the man who created the map of England in the countryside. I think they made a film out of it, where you go up a hill and come down a mountain, or you go up a mountain, come down a hill. I forget the thing. I think it's Hugh Grant that's in it. So the culture does not provide a cognitive map, but a set of principles for map making and navigation. So think about, what are the principles you're designing, not methods, for doing this work, for creating a map of your work. Okay, and your world. Okay, or having kids map it. I mean, one of the questions, I forget who asked, was, could you work with a group in Canada and in Hong Kong and have teachers? Yes. Depends on how you collect records, what roles and relationships you want, and what you're asking people to do. And I'll show, I chose one of the telling cases for that. Okay, so different cultures are like different schools of navigation designed to cope with different terrains and seas. Okay? How many of you have traveled to different countries? So we started with this, right? That's from Brazil. When I did that in Brazil, that was the reaction. So that told me even the nonverbal gestures, others were not appropriate, but it was an anthropologist who made it visible to me because I was talking to him and said, what happened? I just wanted to thank her and say thank you and realize it was an obscene gesture. And that's what I had to do. But this felt to me as an American back in the 80s or end of the 80s, like a male. Boys were the only ones who did the thumbs up. Okay? We had a TV show where they went, hey! And that was not a woman doing it.
Judith, I need to jump in with this question because a question from Anna. I'm just reading it. Why mapping as a concept comes into play here, talking about culture. Mapping of what? Isn't mapping itself the culture?
Okay, so hold on to that one because that's what my whole thing will show you how to do this and why we do it, okay? But I'm still focusing in on language for now, okay? Language carries patterns with it, he says, Michael Agar still. This is his book on language shock. But he came to visit, and there are 3 articles he did. 2 are published in the journal FQS, the Forum for Qualitative Social Research from Germany. And if you want it, it's free and it's online. It's a great journal. Language carries patterns of seeing. We talk about observing all the time, right? Knowing, talking, and acting. And what's missing for me from here, which is the biggest thing for me, is hearing. What do you hear? Because that's where reference comes in. That's where what is being referred to, the meanings are being proposed, recognized, acknowledged, and interactionally accomplished, which is David Bloom's argument for intertextuality. So you have, but they're not patterns that imprison you, but patterns that mark the easier trains of thought and perception and action. Well, ethnographers can't take the easy way, because we're trying to understand from the insider perspective, at least the anthropologically one. What do the insiders need to know, understand, and do? Not the social structuring necessarily, okay? He brought in Worf, who says that language, and here's where he says he would rather use the term languaculture, shapes consciousness. Bakhtin says every word enters your consciousness with everything around it. It doesn't enter as a definition or a dictionary. So it's contextually framed. Shapes ways of seeing and acting. And it shapes ways of thinking and feeling. Now, you could add other things to this. So it isn't just stopping with it. This was where his theory took it. And so then he's talking about languaculture that shapes consciousness, shapes ways of seeing, shapes ways of thinking, but also words aren't just things you memorize, whose meanings fit neatly into a dictionary, which I just said. Words go beyond, and they channel you into ways of thinking, seeing, and acting. That's his definition. And words, he says, are the surface of culture. Culture is a conceptual system whose surface appears in the words of people's language. I needed your questions in order to choose among all the possible things I could talk about, right? What I thought might be of interest. So that's Gumper's. his definition of communicative competence is not the same as Delheim's, which is more structural, or even build off of Chomsky. He says you bring linguistic, cultural, social presuppositions. Gumper's also told me that I'm listening to myself talk, and I'm watching, and I'm trying to see when you smile or give me feedback or write something. So I'm trying to understand the feedback. So they're actually in a two-way conversation, 4 people. Self of the speaker, self of the hearer. The speaker becomes the hearer becomes the speaker in Bakhtin's sense. So you're not talking from one head to the next. How do you, even these little teeny concepts, how do they influence what you'll see, right? That's really the crucial piece. So, and culture in language culture is above meanings that include and go beyond the dictionary and what the grammar offers. Rich points, that's when you come to something you don't know or you're surprised. He calls that a rich point. When we turn that into an anchor, we can trace backward. How did this come to be? Or forward, where did it go? Or sideways, what else was happening? Now, he did this in his book by, that's not my door, I'm knocking. Somebody knocked on his door when he was in Austria. Okay, they came to the door, he came to the door, and they wanted his electric bill to be paid there, to give the money to the man. Now, he's an American. You never give money to people who knock at your door to pay a bill. You send it in at one time by mail. Now you could do mail or your online accounts, but you don't give it to the people who come knock at the door. So he took that as an anchor, that clash, to see how did that come into being in Austria as a practice, okay, not as a challenging context that he didn't know about. So that's what he means when there's a rich point. We talk about, we had a rich point on my not knowing how to say hello in Cantonese, right? He says rich points are everywhere. You just have to act on them if you want as a researcher. He says, but I'm focused on language, and language is loaded with rich points since language carries most rich and complicated symbolic freight that humans exchange. So he's calling exchanges human freight, like FedEx delivering something to me. So what you're doing with meaning making is you're sharing a world in some way, or how you're seeing something, or how you're interpreting something. Qinghua and I had an interesting conversation yesterday about his study that he's publishing or submitting a paper for, and how I saw it and how he saw it and what he was trying to do. Those are the interactional pieces, okay? So there's always several responses possible to any rich point. You have to figure out which one's important. Yeah.
I have a sudden question here. Is there a difference between a frame clash and rich point? I'm reading.
Agar doesn't use the term frame clash. Deborah Tannen and John Gumpers used it in terms of the miscommunication and what happens. They built off of Goffman. It depends on what theories you're building on. I think they're overlapping concepts. I'm not sure they're synonymous concepts. But Irving Goffman was very instrumental in laying out certain concepts. And Gumpers drew on those, but he didn't have them at the center of everything. Okay, so Deborah Tannen and John Gumpers have a chapter on friend clashes back in the 1980s. So it would be, if you're interested, let me know. The challenge for an ethnographer seeking to make visible previously invisible knowledge and patterns of practice is to understand what members of a social group need to know, understand, predict, and produce, not just what they're doing. Because you want to, I always tell people when I meet them on the street and they ask me, what do I do? And, I said, I'm like an anthropologist or a linguist. I try to figure out, if I were you, what would I need to know in order to do the work you do, to be you? And then they get really excited. Oh, you're not going to judge me? No, I'm going to try and understand, if I were you and in your context, what would I have to know and understand and do? And then they'll talk to me for hours.
I think we should, as teachers, we should do this to our students. Actually, saying this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. But it's like, hey, tell me what I need to know in order to do what you do, to understand why you do what you do.
Actually, that was how we taught in the 1960s, some of us. That was more a developmental model. One of my colleagues that I worked in her classroom when I was the reading teacher, she would put boxes around the room and have cards in the boxes. And when she observed the students doing something, she would write down this, and then she would either have a conversation with them, or she would put a group together to teach what she thought they didn't know, rather than just doing it. But by 1970, we went to behaviorism, and then we went to minimum competencies, and then we went to standardized assessments and to curriculum alignment, not to children's learning and development.
In our context, especially to do with the deficit model of international students, they are not children. They're grown-ups, young adults. They have like tons of experience in their first language. And then when they go into an English-speaking university as an international student, they were treated, often, of course, I cannot stereotype. They were treated like children. They were treated like children, as if they don't know anything. Okay, and they never asked why you write what you write, why you said what you said. They would just say, oh, you have a language problem. You have a language deficit. And the professors, engineering, business, they wouldn't ask the students.
But that, Angel, that, you're absolutely right. But that was the shift. MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, just did a major review of the language of elections in the US. And they found 1970 shifted the rhetorical structures and the meanings. That's exactly the period that sent me back to graduate school, in order to figure out how to talk about what we were doing when we were doing open education and multitask environments, which now everybody wants to do again.
I think teachers have just changed their rhetoric to be PC, politically correct. They don't really think.
It's not just the teachers. It's the curriculum theorists. It's the designers. It's the policymakers. Yeah. This is a systems of model.
Yeah.
And it's become ordinary. It's become normalized. And now that we're in this weird space, so you need to look at what's culturally relevant actions and to participate in appropriate ways. This is Shirley Bryce Heath in 1982. She's framing ways that we need to understand what people need to know, understand, produce, predict, to engage in it. And therefore, here's what you have to do as an ethnographer. These are the 4 principles. And Maria Lucia Castaneda and I have just done a piece, and it's also in the new piece, where we did the rethinking of the relationship of language and ethnography. But it was for a Brazilian journal. It's available in English, but it's not one that's going to be ordinarily in people's mindset. But I think it's on my ResearchGate and academia.edu. You can look at it. But the following principles are the key. So You want to be ethnographers, or you want to take an ethnographic perspective? Don't be ethnographers. Okay? Get ethnographic ways of thinking, ethnographic eyes. First thing you have to do, what does it say? Somebody read it. Somebody else read it. I'm tired.
Okay, I would say suspending known categories to construct understanding of local and situated categories and the referential meanings of actions being developed by the participants.
So what does that mean to you?
Well, I mean, to me, I would like to interpret in the way that we need to like I would interpret like I need to be curious of what is happening in the local context, rather than just put my prior knowledge onto it to assign my own meanings onto what is happening in the local. So that's my understanding of it. So
That's sort of like what you're trying to do with your study, right?
yes, that's it.
So the key is, how do people enter a context and they name things? Those namings aren't necessarily what the people understand them to be, right?
Right.
So then you need to do the second step in your research, which is you need to keep those frame clashes as evidence of difference between what you thought and what you now think and understand, right?
Right.
But the next step is what?
Okay, next step is acknowledging the differences between what the ethnographers know and what the actors in the context know.
Okay, so I know some things about Hong Kong because I've been there several times, and I spent a month there with nice people helping me understand the local situation. Except when we went to get a taxi cab at the art museum to go back up to Robert Black, to the dorms where the visitors live. And the cab driver only spoke Cantonese, and my colleague spoke some Cantonese, but not much. He got so upset at us, we had to leave the cab and get another cab. Okay? Because he didn't know how to go up the hill.
You are confusing the taxi driver.
Hey,
sorry, I apologize on his behalf.
No, I thought it was really a perfect example of cultural frame clashes. But I didn't know that most of the people spoke Cantonese until that point. So I know from being in Taiwan with Li Chulin and Feng Min Wang and others that had worked with me, that there are 6 different languages in Taiwan.
More than that, yeah.
Mandarin's the official school language and the official language, and that even on TV you have 2 languages.
Now they have Taiwanese, and then Hakka, and like my heritage is Hakka.
Okay.
Then you have Chinese, Cantonese.
Yeah. So
what's your point by bringing up this?
The point is that I didn't know there were 6 different tonal systems, but I did surprise the people in the sports event when I said ni hao, and I didn't say ni hao. So my intonation surprised them.
Yeah, you haven't been talked about Lang Zai, and Lang Zai is handsome. Lang Zai is something else.
Yeah, well, it's because Lichu would force me to make it the right intonational contour, and I learned it. But in French, I'm bilingual, and my family is multilingual, and so I knew that there are the different languages. I just wasn't aware. So consciousness, remember, becoming consciously aware. So the 4th one says what? This is the thing. So you've now suspended your known category to look at the insider. You've acknowledged that there are differences between what you think and what they do. What do you do now? I was an elementary teacher. I have long wait time. Somebody needs to read it.
So constructing new ways of knowing that are grounded in local and situated ways of knowing, being, and doing the processes and practices of everyday life within a social group or configuration of actors.
Okay, so you don't have to study the whole society. You can just study one piece to know, but you still have to know what are the situated ways. It's always situated of knowing, being, and doing the processes and practices of everyday life within a group. If you want an easy to read book, Shirley Bryce Heath and Brian Street did a small book called On Ethnography. Shirley is a linguistic anthropologist. Brian is, who did a 10-year study in the Carolinas, and Brian is a social anthropologist from England, and they were mentoring a student who was learning to study how to learn about juggling, on the streets of Rhode Island, in a smithy in Rhode Island, okay? And so they would have the dialogue between the juggler, the student who was learning to be an ethnographer, and themselves. It's a little book. It's really good, and it will take you into what this whole process looks like. And then this is the key piece. That's from James Heap, too. What does the last one say to do?
So developing ways of representing or presenting and warranting what is known by local practitioners and what the ethnographers learn from the analysis at different levels of analytic scale.
Okay, that's the key. So you're not just looking at the words or the language. You're looking at different levels of analytic scale, you're triangulating, you're building, but you're building a warranted account, which means you are giving evidence of how you did your work.
Judith Green, I have one question related to triangulations, because my understanding of triangulation often comes from positive frame, where you have different kinds of triangulation methods that will generate the objective world or objective findings. So, and then I see that you use the word triangulation or translate. Okay. And I wanted to know how you construct the understanding of
translation. There is a paper I can give you. It's in an encyclopedia that Mona Lisa Chan and I did. And you could, Bongi, where are you? Are you in Canada or Hong Kong?
I'm in Canada and I'm Korean.
Oh, you're Korean. Okay. Yeah. Well, Mona and I did this piece. There are 3 different schools of thinking on triangulation. Okay? Mm-hmm. One is Campbell and Fisk, predates all what you're talking about in statistics. They said you have to have 3 different correlates to know what you're measuring. So in the field of measurement, they framed a whole model that talks about how you know what you're measuring is what you're measuring, okay? So they don't just do it as an objectivist. Okay. You've got the qualitative people that Norman Denzin wrote on, triangulation, and then you have the ethnographic frames that we're bringing in to multiple angles of analysis that converge, okay? And I'll show you some of that. It's a contrastive frame, but you're still being able to warrant the basis on which you've brought these different perspectives together or different analyses together to create an X. So when we talk about telling cases, we talk about them as cases of what? Okay, what is a case of? It's not case that I just bound this is a society, I'm going to Santa Barbara and that's what, I'm doing a case study of Santa Barbara people on the street. No, you can't do that. It's what's it a case of? That's the question. So from the statistical base, it's different kinds of variables. Now, my dissertation, okay, I did this whole analysis of how to look at the developing text of a class, and I did a whole system, which is in the Kelly and Green book on, this is a science book it's a new book I just published with Greg Kelly. It's an edited volume, but the appendix is the whole of how to look at the different units. So the idea we had was, as a teacher, doing what Dr. Lynn was just saying, was that I looked moment by moment at what the students were doing. I learned to do that as a Piagetian, okay? I learned to do that as a developmental thinker. But I also learned to do it at Berkeley, where there are no answers, only evidence of where you found what and did what. Even in my history program, I had to tell you every place I found it. By the way, American Historical Association style is different than APA, American Psychological, is different than Modern Language Association. If you want to see, Modern Language Association masks the history. You just put it in citations at the end. MLA says you must tell us whose knowledge you're building on. And American Historical says, ibit opsit locit. Where did you find it? How are you using it? What did you do to build your history? So there are different style manuals for different fields. Being a historian in the 1960s at Berkeley, when everything was changing, I learned, because the professor, the first week I was there, told me to hang on to him and I would begin to understand, just like John Gumper said it. So the key is that whose idea of triangulation and how is triangulation being used? If you want, I'll send the chapter, just email me, or I can just remind me. Okay, now if you take these as the basis, we can do longitudinal studies. We can do video-enabled studies. We can trace individuals across multiple cycles, but they're intertextually tied. They're referential. Intertext means somebody refers to something that they've done before, or like the teacher says, well, remember yesterday we did this. Well, that's an intertextual reference. And this is David Bloom and Norman Fairclough and Bakhtin. Okay? You can do individual collective learning and its consequences over time. I'll show you in a minute. Okay? You can do intercultural communication across institutional or national borders. That was one of the questions that came up. Developing intersegmental collaborations. I work with engineers. I don't speak engineering. My work with Greg Kelly taught me I don't know science. I can get the social, but I can't get the science. And if meaning has both social and science, then we need both of us. What members of a group, same thing with the medicine. Susan Bridges creates teams of internal and external ethnographers. But they all have different knowledge bases. You have what members of a social group referentially signal as significant, socially, personally, interpersonally, academically, or work-based. And CLIL has made me rethink that whole relationship for teaching, right? So Sally's paper was really that whole thing of how, as the consultant for the integration to meet the policy in Taiwan, how she and the teacher worked together, because the teacher was transitioning from the old policy to the new. And the frame clash was, I can't just do that. How do I do it with these students who don't know how, So you have these dialogues that allow you to see the thinking. And you don't have to ask questions and do interviews. You have conversations of process. And those conversations of process, if you record them, become records you can then turn into data, right? So if you're working with a group over in Korea, okay, while you're in Canada, No big deal. Record it. Keep a record. Then archive it, index it. If you want a system for doing that easily, go on to Transana. And Transana will let you build your index as you go. Then you can retrieve and add, you can record your decision making. Okay? So
sorry,
yeah.
Judith, because Amy might be maybe Amy might need to leave soon, so I'll give her Amy, she has questions for you.
Okay.
Oh, actually, actually, it's not. I just feel that maybe our questions will be a good tie into what you are talking about analytic skills and also how to represent kind of as researcher and also participants local knowledge and their feelings and meaning making, and also what you mentioned about intertextual tie here. So because it's an emerging question also from listening to along to the seminar and also my recent discussion with Professor Lin on a kind of a how to, because for classroom, for example, the students, they're actually, I'm thinking about a context in science. So you're also talking about social and scientific meanings. So I think it may be a good entry point to ask my questions. Would be like, in a case where like a Cantonese English bilingual teacher talking learning the concept of like transpiration, a very complex scientific concept with the students. He began with like students' experience, everyday experience of watering a plant, and then kind of he develops this idea and also interacting with students, and finally they reach an understanding of how transpiration is a phenomenon that water gets out of the plant. So you could, putting a long story short, but it's kind of like putting a very, it's kind of you need a kind of tracing to understand where students began from the everyday experience. But it's not a kind of two-dimensional phenomenon, right? But it's kind of, we need a kind of a multi-dimensional kind of tracing and for students.
Amy, I'm going to suggest that you get the book because Greg's students and faculty that did this there's actually one really powerful piece in there on emotional response to teaching climate change. But these are all descriptions of how to do the research they did and the topics that they're dealing with.
But Judith, I think Amy's question is not about how to teach science. But
no, it's how to represent it. That's what that's what this book's about.
Yeah, she will read it, but she's in the last stage of her thesis writing. She doesn't have time to read the whole book. But
okay, let me
go. Email her the specific chapter later on. I don't want her to go on a tangent and then I cannot write my thesis because I need to read the book recommended by Judith. Okay. But Amy's question is about when you need to understand how the student is making sense of the teacher's teaching.
Okay, let me show you.
Saying code switching doesn't help. You need to trace the students' experiences back from their everyday experience.
Right, but this is what we call the iterative recursive abductive logic. This was built by us in my research community over the past 3 years, 3 decades. But Melinda Kalanoff, who was just retired from the military, created this model for us to talk about, okay? And how to represent the different things. Now, you see what looks like a DNA strand? The green? Those are different phases, okay? I'll go back one and show you because I did, where are you? There. This is different phases of my life or phases of an event, okay? So that's what she built off, but the way you do it is the first thing you're talking about is the students prepare their mind, the teacher prepares the students' minds to do this, right? But that's not the end. She has them think about and analyze in different ways the concept of
Transpiration.
Okay.
Of plants. It's a
but she's doing it with people. They're doing it not alone. They're not reading a book. They're doing it, right? So the next phase, from preparing the mind, of introducing it to them to know what to think about, to then engaging in it with others, right?
Yes. I think I understand what Amy is asking, but Amy is asking as an ethnographer, a micro-ethnographer. We cannot just gloss over, oh, you're preparing students for it. I mean, it's a glossary. It's a gross summary. We're all preparing students' minds, but how? So the how is by trace. So the ethnographer, the micro-ethnographer, is tracing the semiotic formation. So it's not just preparing the student's mind, but it's actually activating and invoking, co-creating these experiences all at the same time again. So it's not just preparing. Teachers are always preparing students' minds for things, right? This is not a very fine-grained analysis. What Amy is doing is a fine-grained analysis of students' semiotic formation or experience. And that experience is not by, activating your memory only. It is a mashup of your memory plus what is co-created now. So it's something new. It's not just there is a representation in my memory. Now I activate. Okay, retrieve this memory from it's not like that. It's co-creating a new experience, a new meaning, a new memory. If I understand you right, Amy.
Yeah, I think it's kind
Judith,
of a little
you
bit
have to unmute yourself, Judith.
You like my way of showing you different ways? Anyway, the key is that we're going to take whatever records you have, Amy, right? Tell me what records you have.
I have records of videotaping the classroom interactions, and also blackboard drawings, and also my own observation notes and students writing, and then also post-lesson interviews with the students and the teacher.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. So that one was what we got when Claire Wyatt Smith in Australia sent us 5 videos of 5 different classes of the same boy. And how do we analyze it? Okay? So how are you you have similar things to what we got. Okay? Now, this is how we design, and I'm sorry that the print is bad, but it came out blurry and I didn't have time to redo the whole chart. But it says, what's your overarching question? That's what we call. What's your big question?
I think Amy's big question is not to just focus on that.
No, tell me what the question is.
Amy, tell your question.
I kind of have a gut feeling that the old theoretical frames of like code switching and just or L1, L2, kind of L1 scaffolding for L2 learning, they are not enough to help me understand the phenomenon. So
okay.
Then I'm with you. I agree. Yeah. So then I'm curious, like how how to understand the students experiencing of this kind of learning process better. Yeah.
Okay, so that's your overarching question. That's the big question. Here, our big question is, how can we understand, just like you're asking, right? The ways in which literate practices are shaped and in turn shape the everyday events of classroom life and thus the opportunities that Aaron had for learning. So it's like what you're asking, but it made us step back, not from what we were trying to deconstruct, but from understanding what he was experiencing, which is what I hear you trying to do. Is that right?
No, I don't think that's what Amy's trying to do. It's not only about the opportunities.
No, it isn't about opportunities, Angel. That's the overarching question. Each one of these boxes is a sub-question to get to that big question. So it's not a linear process. The first one were what events were constructed in the classes, where, when, under what conditions, with whom, and with what outcome. So we need to know what they experienced. The microanalytic work comes later, but we have to have the bounded events that he experienced. So for every one of the units, we do that. Let me just go through real quickly and then I'll show you more what that looks like. Okay, so then you create a representative data set to analyze that question, okay? Then you analyze the event, but it often leads you to a new question. So you're not waiting to reduce to get one answer, you're layering, okay? The answer. So first I need to know what the social structuring was, how the people conducted that event, what was the event. So I'm trying to do that. Let me show you instead of all the words. So here's one analysis we did. Okay? This is different units. So we have a logic that goes that people don't talk in sentences. Would you agree? Okay. So I have to be able, and CA does it one way. We do it in a slightly different way, but we use Gumper's contextualization cues: pitch, stress, intonation, pause, juncture, kinesics, proxemics, grammar, lexicon, to look at the units and to hear it, okay? But we didn't do the micro, that level here, because we couldn't see. The camera was on the student's head. All we could do is we could see whatever he was looking at, but we couldn't hear what was actually going on in one of the classes. In another class, we could. So we had an English class and a math class, and were taught very differently. Dr. Lim would like the math class. She would hate the English class. Okay. We had a cooking class. We had a industry metal shop where they had to learn to weld and do metal. I had to bring my brother in to answer what we were seeing because I don't know anything about that. That's his field. And then they had hospitality. So this was a grades 11 and 12. Okay, it was a technical and further education program, not a traditional high school. And in Australia, the last 2 years of schooling are either technical and further or college oriented. And he was in technical and further. So what we did is look at phase units, phases of activity, the sequence within the phase, the interactional spaces. Was it individual working with a textbook? Was it small group? Let me move this so I can. The norms and expectations that were being signaled to do the work, the literate practices, the ways of working with text, and then the notes and comments. And we said, although it was not visible, it seems as if they traded papers and were correcting each other's papers. So that's the interpretation of what we could see. Okay, but now 1 minute later, okay, that's 1 minute later, they were test correcting. And then you have Aaron takes out his binder and he shares something with his neighbor and they talk. I can't hear what they're talking about, but I can see them talking. If student-student pairs, that's a grouping, you have this. So this gives us a picture of the structuring, right? What's happening moment by moment across time. Okay. What happened? Okay, I can take all those elements and put them together, but we'll come back to this a different time. What's going on? Let me go here and then go back. Okay. It's, okay. So we're on let me take new place. Okay. This is the teacher's goals. Do you have the teacher's goals for yours? Amy?
You mean for my last, the teacher's goals?
She's frozen, so there's an internet problem.
Okay,
so this is best to create a curriculum of student. Okay, students as inquirers, okay? So we have her statement, and she's my co-researcher. So she gave us this as her goals for the students, okay? Then we went to reconstructing it. Here's how it looked for Beth, okay? Positing new overarching question, framing the telling case study. So this is what we did. How are the opportunities for learning constructed in the classroom? How different participants contribute to this process of construction? In which way can this process of construction be, and it should be represented? Now that was the big question. It led to analysis of the onset of community. We just published a paper that shows you from the minute, the exact time they enter the classroom, what was said to them, how it was done, who got to do what, in what ways, and how the teacher built a cultural processes and practices of being a student in that class. Okay? That is what I need in order to select what to do microanalysis on. We call it zooming in and zooming out. That led to, I'll go back. Okay. That led to what was accomplished through the construction of the events identified. And how were students positioned in these events?
I think, Judith, while you're doing this, I just want to make a quick comment that ethnography is best to uncover the unspoken and invisible norms and expectations, and also the methods and procedures that a cultural group, they have developed, their ways of doing things, their ways of seeing things, their ways of acting and interacting. So most of the time, these norms are not even available consciously to the cultural insiders. If you interview them, they won't be able to tell you. So doing ethnography is the best for uncovering this kind of insider knowledge, but the insider cannot tell you by just interviewing them. Because they know how to do it, they might not be able to represent it verbally to you. So just interviewing them about the classroom expectations, cultural norms, how are you doing things, the way you are doing, they might just make up a story to tell you, which is another piece of data. But Amy, I don't think you are just focusing on this. That is, you're not just, I mean, it's part of it, but your overarching aim is not to uncover the norms, the cultural norms in the classroom. How people are doing what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing and how they co-create their own expectations of each other. This is not your overarching research question, which can be part of it, but not the most important one from what I know. right?
Yeah. It seems to me that Judith has encountered some technical problem. She's offline.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe we'll wait for her. But I think I understand that Judith is trying to kind of make her case, like opportunities for learning, as a parallel to, like, I'm trying to understand students' experiencing, right? So it's kind of talking at a kind of like X is, I want to understand how X is
Opening opportunities for learning.
yeah. So because I think in my case it's kind of a interdisciplinary, also kind of a
So what's your main question? Can you explain it in one sentence, Amy? What's your main research question? Explain it in one sentence.
and
Main question, overarching research question.
Overarching research question it will be, I want to understand like how this holistic classroom experience come. Well, it's kind of it's actually two intertwining questions. One is how the students experiencing, as they reported in the post-lesson interviews, are different from the existing frameworks that we traditionally use to understand, right? That's the starting point. And then the second would be like what the teacher has been doing that will generate such kind of stimulate a different experience for experiencing for the students. Yeah, it's kind of two intertwining.
But then we cannot get into the minds of the students. So how do you know how students? I'm posing it as a devil's advocate. How do you know how students, or like what students are experiencing? Even if you interview them, they might tell you one story. They might.
No, you can get it in a variety of ways. Okay. One, if you want direct, they'll answer your questions, but you don't know that that's really what they were thinking. But you can trace the student over time. Now, Bakhtin says, sooner or later, what is heard and actively understood will find its way into the behavior and meanings and texts of, in the future. If you want it in the exact moment, don't do it. If you trace it over a cycle of activity, and you will get to see the change. Now watch. Let me try. Okay? Oh, come on. What's going on? Okay, so you produce transcripts of whatever you're doing. Okay, I'm not going to go here. This is an event map of the first day. Do you have maps of each of the days that you're analyzing?
Yeah. Actually, I think I've been following the approach of mapping the lesson activities, and I think to put my question, I think what I'm asking at this stage now is a theoretical question. It's kind of now I trace the phase, the sequence and the phase and the cycles, and then I kind of begin to understand how this teaching and learning process has unfolded. But then it's also a way of kind of finding appropriate new terms to capture this kind of like, because the students are not just doing like traditionally we would just say beginning from their everyday experience, and then the teacher scaffold them, and they then finally can produce an L2 standardized text.
Yeah, I understand all that. What I'm trying to do is get you to step back. You already have it. You just haven't figured out that you have it.
Okay.
So I want to try and take you through this cycle. Okay, this is across days. The teacher introduced the students to watermelons. Okay, she brought a watermelon for every table group, and they had to become mathematicians. How would mathematicians understand watermelon? Okay, and so she wanted them to begin to figure out how they were going to figure out how much it weighed, how much it cost, how to think as a mathematician. Okay, you're talking about how they're building ways of thinking that are different. Thinking as a verb, not as a cognitive process. Carl Fredrickson, do you have the handbook chapter for the Marquis book?
I will send it to you, Amy. I have the chapter.
Okay, send them Fredrickson and Donen. Because Fredrickson and Donen, Carl Fredrickson's a cognitive psychologist, but he says you cannot see into the head. He gives you permission not to. You can only see in the discourse. Okay? So you have evidence over time of that discourse. Now, what happened here is the teacher introduced the whole class, right? This is first column, is what was introduced to the whole class. And then the next phase of her work put them into small group, table groups, individual at a table group. Okay, so they went from making an estimate, personal estimate, to then having to talk at the small group about their estimate, to come up with a table group. They had a scale they could go weigh it on. A couple of the groups decided they could call the market and find out how much it was per pound. It depends on how they decided on decision making, okay? And then the table group reported in 2 languages to the whole class. It was English and Spanish, okay? But they had a bilingual person who was able to be there as the third thing. So you had Spanish dominant, English dominant, and bilingual, right? So they went here. And what this does is it traces the progression from establishing an interactional space to constructing a line in a learning log. These were the actions they had to take in this space, okay, to get ready. Then it went to the table group, and they were to construct personal estimates. So they got the watermelon, they weighed it, whatever, they hadn't weighed it yet, they were guessing, because that's what you wanted to show them. Guesses are not mathematically rich. Okay, so that was the process. And then what happened is they went to the table group, then shared their personal estimate, and they negotiating a group. That's why I asked you about present continuous verbs plus objects. If you create a grammar for the actions that the teacher is doing with them and the actions the children are doing, like present continuous verb or whatever your grammar structure you want to do is, then you're showing what she's orienting them to, what kinds of thinking the teacher's trying to get them to do, right? Then when they presented the group estimate, this was what was fun. She recorded the group estimate on the board. So she's making it possible for students to see the different groups and how they estimated their watermelons. They're working on the process of thinking and process of learning to do this kind of thinking, not focusing on just the language and grammar, okay? And so orienting, one group got up and the boy she had monitored the groups, and the boy did not give the group estimate, he gave his personal estimate. So she sent the group back to negotiate again. So there's a whole social fabric being built. One of the things I hear you talking about is it's not about X, Y, and Z. What is it about? And that's why I'm suggesting that maybe the language of building these configurations, the different actions taken and things become one base for you to look at as a lived experience. Then they went back and negotiated, but they renegotiated the estimate and came back to the whole group. But then the teacher sent everybody back to their own learning log. They have a little notebook. And they had to write and reconstruct the whole event. These were 5th graders, 10 years old. Okay, so the practice she did allowed them to first make a guess, negotiate, present the individual thought, negotiate with the group, then present to the whole class, get feedback on it. When it was okay and they did it, the whole group's estimate, that was fine. If it wasn't, she sent 2 groups back to do it again, because you're not supposed to take over and just give your own personal opinion, which is learning to do mathematical thinking as a group, in a group, okay? And then coming back and recording your own thinking and actions, all right? Okay, let me just go on to the, so again, I can make a map, and this one is the defining ways to approach the problem.
Yeah.
We're freezing on the internet. Okay, you're back. Sorry, you froze.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I kind of learned. It's kind of giving me an opportunity to sit back, and what I get from what you've been showing me would be part of tracing the learning processes is because they're actually practicing science, right? So the classroom interaction details can show one aspect of how those thinking and experience come into being, and as a process of scientific inquiry, or that is also part of it, right?
Okay.
That's one.
That's one thing, but you can do it across days or across configurations. This one is the same, all those processes we identified, but we did them across days.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, we did it across a 10-year period to show when English only came in, what was missing. There were only 3 practices missing. One practice was choosing the language to speak in. One process was choosing a language to write in, and one was to write your thinking, which was the learning log. What happened was 2 years later, after English only got voted in, okay, they let them go back to speaking 2 languages because we have a policy at the federal level that you have to be able to give the students access. Exactly, that's Law versus Nichols in the United States. It's a Supreme Court decision. The second one was the writing never came back. We have 2 sisters 2 years apart in the same class doing the same processes. And we can show you the difference in what they could perform in writing essays and things in English only for their whole life, or English with Spanish support or Spanish with English support. Because it was a fluid bilingual, and the English dominant students had to listen through the Spanish, and the Spanish had to listen through the English, and it wasn't simply restating literal translations. Okay? And they did it even at the school level. The principal did it too. So they picked up this model and built it. So the key is that you can then put it into a table like this to show the repeated pattern and the developing pattern. It becomes evidence. What you're doing is providing a visual representation of evidence of the pattern existing.
And how do you? Well, can you kind of, because when we talk about pattern, it's kind of a very easy get into this kind of structuralist interpretation. I do understand what you mean by, because sometimes we will tend to think about language as patternings, right? As formal.
Well, okay. So David Bloom has 4 things that 5 things you think about. What's being proposed? What's recognized? What's acknowledged? What's interactionally accomplished? that you can show is socially, academically, interpersonally, whatever significant to do the work and keep going. There's microanalytic work from the book shows that, but he also shows that identities are being framed in that micro bit and power relations are being framed. So what you're really suggesting is what David has done. You're saying that in the talk, they're signaling certain things as counting in James Heap's sense. Okay? What counts as a way of doing this work? The pattern is what you are building. That here's one pattern, orienting work in and through different interactional spaces. Every single day that event occurred, that process occurred. So that's a pattern. It's repeated. It's not an idiosyncratic one-off time. It becomes an expectation in the class. This only happened on 2 days, situating events, activities, or practices in history. History as a tradition, participants' histories, for the purpose of drawing on histories as a resource or a new way of thinking, okay? She only did that the first 2 days. She did it again later in cycles, but not these days. So within the boundary of this cycle, of these 6 days, these are repeated elements. Repeated elements create a pattern. Patterns create expectations or norms and expectations. Expectations become norms if they are more stable. Okay? But that's a social theory, not a language theory. Okay? Here you have the literate practices. We did the same thing. Choice and use of languages. We have it across every day. But when we put it into years, we could show you the missing element. So it wasn't even available to be known or done. Okay? So you have labeling data, a log, and data entries. That's thinking scientifically, by the way. You have to put your name on it, the date. You have to keep your record so you can go back and reconstruct. Greg Kelly calls that a science practice. Okay? You taking and recording notes went across 1, 2, 3 days of the 6. So when you're asking for the boundary of something, what is the time frame? And I'll tell you why I asked that. Back in my graduate student days, we did an analysis of using an observation system. But because we looked at the language, we saw that the event on day 1 wasn't finished. It took 3 days to finish the lesson. So we went through the lesson over the 3 days and saw different patterns of language. Okay? But you're tracing that to show what counts. So in doing it, this is one way of doing it, is this kind of a table chart. And so the question was, what did we learn? Now, this is from a 2004. There was a meeting in Mexico of 35 qualitative researchers. This will make you feel better. No 2 researchers had the same definition of classroom. Okay? But this is what they learned. Understanding how to conceptualize learning. This is what this group it was Cesar Cole from Spain, Antonia Candela from Mexico, Elsie Rockwell from Mexico, and those are the 3. They brought 35 people from different countries, France, Brazil, Argentina, different countries. Different perspectives may have somewhat incompatible understandings of learning as a social process underlying them. If you're trying to build an argument for it, you can use their words to say this is a call or what's become known. And it's true. I did a multiple perspective book, and we can show you how Judy Harker did an analysis of semantic and the cognitive demands. I did it of the social, and Joanne Golden of the literary. Very different interpretations of the same event. Once you get something like that, you say, good, then I can make up my own, as long as I show them how I'm doing it. So I don't have to draw on everybody's language. I can build a language for this, which is what you're doing. Developmental theories of learning imply movement from less to more knowledge, competence, and understanding. Okay? Collaboration with teachers' attempts to increase their, as well as the ethnographer's understanding of research on learning and child development. These are all the things that went across this group of people. Understand, but not everybody agreed to each of these. Understanding present events requires knowing what has happened before, and therefore considering the various histories of the participants, the class, and the school. Further, advances in understanding the complexity of classroom did require building bridges and engaging in joint efforts with local participants to understand the problems. So you're breaking down all those traditional models to build a model to understand how this is happening, right? Not just what's happening. How and in what ways and under what we have a litany. How, in what ways, under what conditions, drawing on what resources, with whom, for what purpose, with what kind of outcome or consequence for what can be done next. Angel, did you?
Judith, I'm aware of the time. I think, Amy, we need to have a private section with Judith. Oh, on your own. Okay.
But you have to show me. I will,
like an hour now.
I will do that. I will do that if you show me what you're doing, not just tell me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The key to the writing project is show, not tell.
So,
okay. So anyway, let me just show you one thing. Okay. This again, we're mapping down. Let me just show this. This is the essay the two boys wrote in English and Spanish together. That's a piece of evidence. We can map backward to how it came into being or what go forward. So any moment you have can become a rich point for your analysis. And that's true of any of you, right? Everybody's frozen.
I can hear you.
It's true of any of you, what you're doing. If you're going to do a situated framework and you're going to make visible to somebody who wasn't there what you're seeing, what you participated in, and then how you analyzed it. It's really, really hard for readers to trace what you know without you making explicit how you came to know it. And that's why I do ethnography, because what I didn't tell you was when I was a teacher in a school in LA, a reading specialist, I went back to 6th grade and I asked to do individualized reading, and the superintendent said no. And he brought 12 people into my class to make sure I wasn't doing individualized reading. Okay? All my students were working on something quietly, and I was working with a group. But he never looked, nor did any of his people, at what they were actually doing. Every student was on a different page with a different assignment based on their need. I individualized, but he saw it only as a structure. So how to see what's actually happening is what you're talking about. And that's what the ethnographic base is, okay? Sorry, I just get so involved with this because it takes years to learn to do this and be articulate.
We must have another session with you. We're into the 3rd hour, so I'm very aware of the time. And I would like to invite Phoebe to ask any final questions from you or from what you have collected from our doctoral students. Over to you.
Okay, thank you for the time for raising some questions from our group. And actually, a lot of my peers are concerned about, because we are all doing the research in different contexts, and you mentioned a lot about the values, the importance of culture, and then we are realizing that there are so many dynamic patterns, and then we recognize the patterns with variations, and that's the valuable thing of the telling cases, and it's ongoing. So if we all need to collaborate with people with different disciplinary knowledge, they have different expectation on culture and also literacy practice, and also multilingualism, translanguaging, transsimultizing expectation. What would be the most useful advice from you and Professor Lin about how to let people all see the same direction or goals? That's very important, because when we start a research project, no matter for doctoral research or other research project for inclusive education, we need to co-create values and visions. And it affects all the methodology, all the research methods, everything. So how would ID help as a logic of inquiry to coordinate and also motivate people to see the same direction? And that's the main question I think I can generate and summarize from my peers. Thank you.
Great. So Phoebe, your question is it's actually usually not even a transdisciplinary team, even with your own team, your own colleagues in the same department. They might have different disciplinary training, different frames of interpretation. So your question is how to achieve some common ground, some intersubjective relations that we are all talking about similar. When we use a term, we mean similar things, right? Because sometimes when you use one term, we all mean different things, right? So this is your question. Okay. But Judith is offline, and maybe I can answer your question. I think Judith already using her earlier slides. If you go back to her slides earlier, she traced back the different historical development of different disciplines: sociolinguistics, social theory, ethnomethodology, sociocultural theories. So she did this historical analysis of different communities. They come up with different ways of understanding and different ways of using even a similar term. So doing this kind of work and laying it out in front of everybody helps everybody where you are coming from. I'm coming from a sociocultural theoretical background, Bakhtinian theoretical background. You're coming from a science education background, conception. So everybody just lay open your theoretical traditions and your training. Yeah. So Emma is okay. So Judith is coming back. Hi, Judith.
Hi. What's happening? Oh, the video's off. Okay. Hi. So I really appreciate the complexity of your thinking. It's really powerful, and the challenges you're facing in terms of the known knowledge and how you're building an alternative frame. Having done that for the last 6 decades, it's a journey. And having people to talk with on the journey who give you feedback is really important. Your questions took me back to my journey. And I really value that. I'm still learning. Gumpers told me that if I gave him 2 years, I'd begin to understand. It took me 18 for one concept, and I'm still learning. So the key is that learning with you and from your work is really very much a privilege. So thank you. I really appreciate it. I think what you're building is really important, and the sites that you're studying are really tremendously valuable. If you could build a common framework for how you step back, how you begin to identify the boundaries of events, the boundaries of what's being constructed in the classroom, rather than just zoom into the language, and then go back and look at it. That's why we talk about zooming in and zooming out, because every moment has a history. Dr. Lin told you the history we have. So my being here is not just as an outsider. So how are you looking at the history being built in that class?
Okay, so I think we need to have some really final questions, because we are going really deep into the night. So I'll go through Tsinghua, Bengi, Phoebe, Amy, okay? And then we have to end this section, but it doesn't mean the end of our interactions. Tsinghua.
Much. I think what I've learned today is actually a lot of the ways of analyzing the data. It's actually a lot of the details of going into the fine-grained analysis. Because in the past, I thought that my analysis would always be something pretty general, and I find a tool that I can go deeper. So I think that's something that I can look back and learn more and try to at least test it myself and to say what happens.
Thank you. Bengi? Unmute yourself.
Okay. So one of the things that I really appreciate is that understanding linguistic ethnography and then how to tackle both, like combining both emic and ethic perspectives, and like training, being trained from conversation analyst and then as the methodological traditions. I was overwhelmed by just too much emphasis on microanalysis, and then being seen as it's a very scientific approach, and there is no other alternatives. So for me, looking at the detailed data sets, that tracing the historicities and moments allows me to not only engage as a researcher as vividly, and then also being able to understand not only the moment, but in terms of different times and space. So I really appreciate your opening eyes to us about how to understand the world in a different angle.
Okay, Amy, we have to be quick. We have reached the limit of YouTube sections.
Sorry for occupying, but it's kind of fortunate for me to use my question to kind of happen to tie in of something that Judith also want to share. What I have learned, or kind of my take-home message from this session will be there are different perspectives, even looking at the classroom interaction processes, and it's just what I had the dialogue with Professor Judith Green is kind of probably kind of reminded me of something that I have forgotten because I'm too immersed into the data, but also kind of realizing that some aspects may be more related to social semiotics and what I'm really looking for. So then it's kind of I need to also sit back and think about it more kind of a more, I don't know, but it's kind of very inspiring to kind of have some quiet moments to really think about what you are looking for and what it is and what can be achievable within a PhD time frame, and some might just be a beginning. Thank you so much.
Judith, unmute yourself first. Judith, unmute yourself.
Oh, I mute myself. I'm not muted.
Yeah, it's okay now. I can hear you.
Okay, I was just going to say, a dissertation is the base of your future work. That's what I understand after more than 50 of them. Okay? What you want to do is what's researchable and reportable in the dissertation, because when you go on to your career, you will take forward that base. So don't think you have to answer all your questions. Focus in on which question is reportable at this time through this kind of analysis in this way that I can make transparent and build warrants for. Then I can call for what I need to do next. So any dissertation has four things you report. What you do that supports other people, what you do that challenges other people, what's news, that was James's question. And then what are the future directions? So you don't answer everything from the dissertation. You make it a researchable topic and lay the foundation for future. I've been doing the same thing for 6 decades, but in different settings, different people, different kinds of things, so I can understand how it goes from one place to another, not just one setting.
Thank you, Judith. Now, all my research students, listen up, okay? You don't need to do everything in your thesis. It's just the basics.
Yeah, you can never
Try to get your perfect thesis, and you will never get it done.
No, the thesis gets you your credential, and maybe the key is that you have to go on. So you're building the foundation for a program of research.
Yeah, you have to move on. All my research students, listen up. Okay, you have to move on. Write your final chapter. Okay.
Yeah, well, and your final chapter is what I just said. It's what were your questions, and what did you find? What did it support that others have done? What does it challenge that others have done? What's news that nobody's thought about? Okay, and then you do, what are the implications for future research? Okay, and if you want for teacher training or whatever you want to extend it to. But if you do those sections, you can do a 10, 20-page final chapter because you put a summary of all your findings. And then you can talk about how they support or constrain or challenge or, what else is needed, because you can't answer all the questions at one time. But here was my question.
I don't know why. When I was a research student, I thought I'm going to save the world. I'm going to save the education system of Hong Kong. I'll go back to Hong Kong from Canada. I'll be the hero, not the Superman, not the Superwoman. I'll save the schooling system in Hong Kong. Okay, I'm just joking. I'm just laughing at myself. Okay.
Well, I didn't have that goal. All I had was a goal to get even for losing. Okay, so my goal was to get even because they took away the best educational innovation to put in this other model. Okay?
I don't know why, as research students, we have that goal of making the perfect thesis and saving the whole world. Anyway, I'm just saying, listen up to Judith. Don't have this Superman, Superwoman mentality when you write the final chapter of your thesis. It's just the starting point. The journey is long. Okay.
Oh, just think about what you did was you found the magic bullet in order to do more research.
Phoebe, over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, I enjoyed all the things today. What I would like to say is, I think IE, as the logic of inquiry, has full potential to outreach more local teachers in Hong Kong. Because from my understanding, because teachers in Hong Kong are so busy, but they are very engaging. Their students are very dynamic. We don't want to just focus on students as a classroom or a group. We want to pay attention to their individual variation, and we need to respect our students. And this is from IE, Interactional Ethnography, that I learned that as a teacher, our focal point should not be just on the ways we teach or the knowledge we construct. We want to pay attention to their rights, and also pay more attention to how to respect our students and their interaction, their patterns. And that's what I learned from Judith and also your team and all the people who engage in this kind of contribution, and also, of course, for my mentor, Professor Lin, as well, and my peers. And hope that we can pass this motivation on. And then I want to help local teachers to understand that it's not too life-threatening if you are busy teaching, but at the same time you are researching. I hope that more local teachers can enjoy research as well.
So would you like a journal that the teachers wrote with us? The National Council of Teachers of English used to publish a journal called Primary Voices. Some of them I put up on ResearchGate, but the teachers were the researchers who wrote. And we decided that it was supposedly the theorists would write the theory and then the teachers would show what they did. No. Our special issue has two principals who talked about how it changed the way they saw and entered classrooms. It had teachers talking about how they did their work, and we talked about teachers as theorists. One of the things we need to go back to, which is when I first started teaching, national tests were good, state were better, local were better, but teacher tests were the best because they knew kids. By 1970, that shifted to national tests only counted. Okay? But Sally's work, if you go look at what she did, has done a brilliant job of mapping out how the local teacher and the specialist work together to build the integration of CLIL and how Sally then took up certain roles, but the teacher took up other roles. So it's about re-envisioning that educational process, which you are all doing. And that's where you have to give yourself 3 to 5 years, because it says that's how long it takes to change anything. And that's a piece of the puzzle, is that lay the foundation for what you want to do in the future in your dissertation. Then you're taking it and have a solid ground for doing the kind of changing the system that Angel wants.
I know that I'm not a superwoman, Superman. The more years I have gone through, I know I'm really super little man, super little
No, you are, but in a different way, which is shaping a whole different community and way of thinking. And that, to me, is a Superman, Superwoman model.
Our next generation is our Superman, Superwoman generation. They will do so much better than us.
Well, and also with all the COVID virus and everything else, we have to have new ways of understanding.
Right. So with that, I want to thank Judith, but don't go away yet. We're announcing our next seminar. So Qinghua, please share screen. Our next seminar will be 2 months or 1 month from now. 2 months, July 31st. Is that right? July 31st? Because July 30th is my birthday. Yeah. So July 31st. So Qinghua, can you share screen of our next? It's also super, super interesting topic.
I've already.
And then Judith, you are not off the hook. We will get you back again later. Okay. Later in the year.
I'm always happy to talk one-on-one too if you want to do that. So let me know if you need something.
Yeah. So the next seminar. Yeah, the next seminar is Play in Education as Dialogic Practice, a chronotopic analysis, and we will we will have Anna Marinovich Shane, from Delaware. So that will be July 31st, 5 p.m. Vancouver time, but that will be August 1st, 8 a.m. Asian time or Hong Kong time. Okay, so thank you so much for staying on into the third hour. So Judith, you broke the record. And YouTube is pushing us to end our section. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And during these COVID pandemic times, we're so honored that our guest speakers are all doing this work voluntarily. And I'm thankful to all the research students who are co-hosting this. So give us a like and subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to set up reminders for our upcoming events. It will be even more exciting. Okay? Thank you. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you all.
I love you, Judith. I love
you too.
Bye.
Ciao. Oh, bye.